This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, Michael Coveil. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Bradley Hope. He is a Wall Street Journal reporter. He also happens to be the author of Billion Dollar Whale, the man who fooled Wall Street, Hollywood, and the world. Now this is cool stuff. We're talking right there with Den of Thieves, those kinds of Wall Street books where you just say, how could this happen? Well, what happened exactly? One guy essentially stole $5 billion with the help of Goldman Sachs, and boom, now where's the money? What an amazing tale. Something we just can't even expect would happen in the last few years. We thought all of this stuff stopped. How could you fool governments? How could you fool Wall Street? How could you get away with it? Bradley Hope and his co-author, Tom Wright, get right into the heart of the matter. What an amazing story. As a fellow author, I'm a little bit jealous. How much fun would it be to get under the covers to figure this out? And these guys figured it out. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Bradley Hope. You know, I was thinking, Bradley, most Americans really don't have a feeling for, let's say, a place like Malaysia. It's something on the map. But this movie that came out in the last handful of years, The Wolf of Wall Street, this classic scene in there where DiCaprio is scamming somebody over penny stocks or whatnot, then he's got the beautiful girlfriend. The film does really well. I personally didn't really like it because I think it glorified a bunch of shysters, but in terms of entertainment, it's good and all that kind of fun stuff. But isn't it fascinating when we start to kind of go behind the scenes and say, you know, we usually don't think about where does the financing for a film like that come from? And as it turns out, part of the financing, maybe all of it, I'm not sure, you'll have to tell me, the financing for that film literally came from one of the biggest Wall Street scandals ever. So rich, huh?
That's right, yeah. It's pretty incredible that it's almost too ironic to believe that a film like that would have been almost completely funded by a fraud that was way bigger than anything Jordan Belfort could ever cook up. His penny scams and stuff resulted in a lot of wealth for himself, and he had a big yacht of his own, but it was just nothing compared to the 1MDB scandal, which is the way that that film was funded.
Now, was all of the film funded with this scam? We're going to explain the scandal in a second, but was all of the film funded literally with scammed money?
That wouldn't be 100%. I think that I would just say the majority of the film, because they did take out some financing around that film as well. And they pre-sold the foreign rights, for example. They had other little techniques that they used to help fund it. But in the high tens of millions, like maybe close to 100 million.
Now, I don't want to go too far off on a tangent because we can go in so many different directions in our conversation today. But I have to think, and this is going to apply to a lot of different players, that once the stolen loot is used for things, the attorneys get involved, the regulators get involved, the governments get involved. And I think it's probably an interesting story behind the scenes about those people that perhaps made money from the Wolf of Wall Street, what's going on behind the scenes. Because I know some of the actors, or at least DiCaprio, had to return funds.
Yeah, well, the way that this has worked so far is the Department of Justice has sought to recover all these different assets that were bought with stolen money. And when it comes to the films, they froze the rights to the profits due to the production company. So the production company is called Red Granite, and that company was the one that was a vehicle for some of this stolen money to fund the film. They just froze that particular stream of profits and said, this is what we're going to seize, the future rights to profits, not the old profits that you may have retrieved, but your future rights to profits. And then later on, that production company actually did a settlement with the U.S. government where they paid, I can't remember the exact amount, but it was in the tens of millions of dollars to just settle all the asset seizures related to the film. There was other films too. It was Dumb and Dumber 2. I think there was one film called Friends with Kids, and Wolf of Wall Street was the biggest one. All of those future profits that was due to the production company were originally frozen, then they settled it, and now that company is unencumbered. They settled it for enough money that the government was content that they had done their job on that.
So let's go ahead and pry open the lid here, because I've kind of put some touchstones out there, and I'm sure some people know something about this story already, and probably some people are thinking, what is this guy Mike talking about? What kind of questions is he asking Bradley? So Malaysia, the starting point for the funds that were used to fund The Wolf of Wall Street come from Malaysia. And just as a little bit of background, I mentioned to you, I've had the chance for the first time in the last 5 years to spend some time in Malaysia. And Malaysia is an interesting place. It's kind of like, it's not as sophisticated as Singapore, but it's pretty close. You go to Malaysia and there are malls there that you don't see in America necessarily. I mean, there is some extreme wealth there. There's some extreme growth, development. I mean, it's a pretty sophisticated place and the people are quite pleasant. And I actually find that many of my Malaysian friends that I've had, their English is some of the most Americanized English in Asia. So it's an interesting place. It's a contrast of cultures. Not a lot of Americans go there. I found that I felt like I was very rare to be there, but it was an interesting place. So let's set the stage though for this money and where this money ultimately came from. Because I think the story really kind of starts with a former prime minister of Malaysia and a young financier. And I'm talking 27 years old?
Yeah, even younger when he first got started. This whole saga began, we like to think it began with Joe Loeb more than anyone else. He's a young Malaysian guy of Chinese descent, born in Penang, which is this little island that's quite a famous tourist destination.
Wealthy family, good education.
Yeah, he came from a wealthy family, relatively wealthy family by any standards, multimillionaire family. He went to a school in Malaysia up until his last 2 years of high school. His dad sent him to Harrow in England, which is this really posh boarding school where people wear all kinds of funny, antiquated things, and they have lots of traditions. And I guess you could say he was a big fish in a small pond, his family in Penang, to Harrow, where he was poor compared to some of the people who he was there with. There was children of royals from Brunei, from the Middle East. So he was really suddenly surrounded by this ultra wealth, and it obviously really got his attention. And then he went on to befriend a lot of these guys. Then he went to Wharton. And around that time, he began to he kind of conceptualized what it was he was going to do with his career. He didn't ever get a real job. He didn't go to work in a bank or somebody else's investment company. Even when he was still at Wharton, he created this private equity group called Winton. And he got a couple of those friends from Harrow and Wharton, their parents, to kick in a couple of $1 million. Then he went and borrowed a lot of money, and that was his first company. So he was wheeling and dealing. He was even things like helicopter deals, and it's unclear to us if any of those deals actually made any sense or if he made any money on them, but that's what kind of put him on the map in Malaysia. And the other thing that was going on was when his family was living in London, they had a place in London that was kind of their home away from home. And all the Malaysians tended to flock to this one particular corner of London in Mayfair that just happened to be, I think maybe there was even a marketing push for this one particular development in Malaysia that attracted a lot of the wealthy Malaysians. And so while he was there, one of the rich people that he befriended was the family of Najib Razak, who at the time was kind of famous because his dad was a really famous prime minister of Malaysia, Tun Razak, but he wasn't yet the prime minister. He was minister of defense. He was a known figure. Actually, the family sometimes described themselves as the Kennedys of Malaysia because they have this long history and kind of a dynasty. Here was this young guy. He made friends with these connected political figures.
The future prime minister of Malaysia.
The future prime minister. He knew these people, and he started, from a young age, he kind of had this special, uncanny ability to notice what makes people tick. What are the things they need, the little problems they have, and that sort of thing. And so even from a young age, he was starting to work on those things for Najib's family because I guess he had in his mind, this guy is probably going places. He's in line to become a prime minister at some point, and this is a guy that I want to be connected to. Even before this whole 1MDB scandal, which we'll get to in a minute, he was already doing things for this family. For example, we found a record that showed there was a British Virgin Islands company that he was the director of it, and the owners were Rasma, which was the Najib Razak's wife, the future first lady, and Riza Aziz, which is her son, and the future producer at Red Granite, which we talked about earlier. So even before the scandal, he was running this BVI company for them that essentially was paying a bunch of bills, including the housing bills of the daughter of Rasma. But at the same time, I think he was really struggling to figure out how he was going to actually make money, because as much as he is an amazing person to perceive how people work and how to get them to do things, I don't think he was actually a brilliant businessman. And especially if you're 24, 25 years old, it's pretty hard to take, say, $20 million, which is what the Winton Group had, and actually make money. I mean, there's a whole lot of things to learn. The deals out there, there's lots of deals that lose money, obviously, and he had no experience. So he kind of bumbled along for a few years, trying to find a way to get some good deals, get some brokerage fees for himself, because he had this opinion of himself as this, he wanted to become this majorly wealthy guy, kind of in the vein of those royals and people that he knew from school. Even when he was in college, he had not yet really made any money. He was throwing huge parties for himself and making himself the center of attention, which is also kind of funny because Joe Lowe is actually really a shy guy. He's kind of a chubby, shy fellow. It's almost, if you see a picture of him and you're told, look, this guy might be behind these future financial crimes, it would be shocking to anyone. And a lot of the students that went to school with him have called us up after our book came out and said, I can't believe he did this. You know, I knew him. He was in my marketing class, or he was in my whatever, different classes, and he was so shy. I can't imagine he would be able to pull something off like this. So here we have this young guy. He's trying to make some money to fit this idea of himself. He eventually gets to doing some deals in Malaysia, including a big real estate deal. But even then, he's still not really making all that much money. And
when you say not all that much, are we talking a young guy in his mid-20s who's made $1 million already on real business, or still kind of just enough to get by kind of thing?
There's some money being made, but I have a theory that we haven't yet really proven out that Winton Group, it actually was 100% leveraged, and he was redistributing some of the principal and some of the debt to people as actual profits. That's my theory. I haven't gotten to the bottom of it yet. It's kind of an important theory because it goes back to the question of why does this thing keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger? You know, a lot of times when there's a fraud or a siphoning of money, it's kind of more sustainable than what this actually became. And my theory is that at Winton, it was the beginning of the hole that he could never fill. So I think he did make some money, but he had a lot of expensive debt. He had already distributed principal, but that money kept going back into the hole, and he would live another day, you know?
Let me let you define really quick, though, before you continue. Put some scope, some parameters on the scandal. I mean, J-Lo, we can go back in a second and kind of continue where you left off, but he basically stole $4 to $5 billion from Malaysia. Is that essentially the story?
Yeah, I think that's about right. The final number, it'll take a long time to figure it out, but we think of it as a $5 billion scandal at the minimum. And a lot of that money is gone and unaccounted for. A lot of it was spent on assets that range from the Wolf of Wall Street to a gigantic $250 million yacht and real estate around the world. And then a lot of it was just paid out to people that were somehow involved, whether extremely involved, like co-conspirator level, to people that weren't really that involved in the actual fraud itself, but were extremely connected to Joe, or in some reason he needed them to be in his pocket, I guess.
So let me take you back in time to where you were, because you're talking about a young guy and trying to leverage up to $20 million. And now we're talking about a $4 to $5 billion scam. So let me let you continue along the path to connect those dots.
And even back when he was this 23, 24-year-old guy, he was still going to nightclubs and casinos and really spending. I mean, you'll never find, perhaps in our time, in this era, a bigger spender than Joe Lowe. Even as a young guy, people were turning their heads because he would walk into a nightclub in, say, the Hamptons or something and drop $40,000, $50,000. Now, for almost everybody in the world, that's a huge amount of money, right? But for Joe Lowe, that was like barely getting started, which we'll get to a little bit later about how he started dropping $2 million in a nightclub in a single night. There's all these things about him that were constant. You know, he loved to be seen as the rich guy at the center of the whole story. And that was at the beginning and that was at the end. And that's probably still even going on now. So what happened was he was doing these various deals. It was never quite enough. One of the things that he was really inspired by was he went to Abu Dhabi. He took a year off from Wharton and was traveling around and meeting people. He went to Abu Dhabi and he was really inspired by seeing a sovereign wealth fund up close and personal. Sovereign wealth funds are obviously, it's kind of a broad category. They range from a kind of passive giant pool of funds like the savings account of a country that are just carefully invested in global stocks and treasuries and real estate, but they're kind of boring, to this new genre of sovereign wealth funds, which is what he saw in Abu Dhabi. There was a fund there called Mubadala Development. Since then, it's gone through a lot of transformations, got much bigger. But back then, it was a new species of sovereign wealth fund because it didn't have an allocation of funds from the government in the same way that those other funds might. Like in the same place, there's the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority, which has $500 billion of assets, the savings from oil sales. Mubadala didn't have any money. It would borrow money. The idea behind it was, perhaps it's an unproven theory or concept, is that if this fund were to borrow money and focus its efforts on improving the local economy, doing strategic partnerships. So, for example, at one point, Abu Dhabi thought they would be like manufacturing microchips. So they did this big deal with AMD. All of these kinds of things were being done at Mubadala Development, which was a debt-driven kind of new breed of sovereign wealth fund.
And these things spin off fees for the Wall Street types involved.
Yes, they do. They're always doing bond issuances and all kinds of complex transactions. So this place was also being run, this Mubadala, it was being run by a really young guy called Khaldoon Al-Mubarak, who's a very charismatic young Emirati guy. Interesting guy. His father was actually assassinated by a Palestinian terrorist back in the 70s. So he kind of came from this heroic family in Emirati culture. And he was very close with Mohammed bin Zayed, who's the crown prince of Abu Dhabi. And this guy, the crown prince, he really runs the whole thing. It's kind of like what we're seeing in Saudi Arabia. The crown prince is really the center of actual governance. There's one guy above both of them, but they run the place.
Basically, J-Lo's getting inspired by seeing some of this stuff up close and personal.
Yeah, he's getting inspired by this kind of like idea of a new kind of financial organization that really drives the strategic vision of a country. And also he develops these relationships with Abu Dhabi that really become important to him. Then he's back in Malaysia and he convinces the sultan of one of these provinces. So Malaysia has these provinces where there's sultans that are kind of like royalty that run each of those provinces. They don't really run them in the sense of like they're the key municipal officer, but they hold an important title in each province. And every few years, they cycle the king between them. And it's largely a ceremonial rule, but they have a bunch of other responsibilities. In Malaysia, there's a state called Terengganu that actually has quite a lot of oil wealth. And so he convinced those guys to create a sovereign wealth fund of their own, a little special sovereign wealth fund for that state. And he got pretty far along. He developed his first relationship with Goldman Sachs, which we'll come back again later on. And again, he was using the Mubadala method. He didn't want to use their savings. He wanted to borrow money and then use that in a strategic way. This little fund, it was called TIA, Terengganu Investment Authority. It's not very well known now because this part of the history, but he managed to get a sign-off for $1 billion loan to this new fund.
How old is he? 25 years old, 24 years old?
Yeah, I think he must be 25 or 26.
This is not that long ago. This is insane.
Yeah, exactly. It's not that long ago. But at the last minute, the Sultan of Terengganu said, actually, you know what? Never mind. Let's cancel this whole project. I don't feel comfortable. $1 billion is a lot of debt. I don't really do debt. This sounds dangerous. Then this is kind of the beginning of a pattern. Gerald Loeb kind of pressed send anyway, and the money was borrowed. So he was told, look, we've changed our mind, don't do this. And he just borrowed the money anyway. But that created a huge problem because now...
Let me interject one thing, though. That must mean, and look, we have the Madoff problem in the States. So when it comes to sophistication and oversight, I'm not about to be as an American to say, some other place is worse or better or whatever. But at this moment in time where he can be told, don't do it, and he still does it, the oversight lacks is the operative word, yeah?
Yeah. And then also this was like a new kind of fund in a place that didn't have these kinds of funds. And he was very clever about making sure that all the right people were deputized and had the authorities and the power to sign contracts and things. But it created a problem because it could have only go two ways at that point. Either the Sultan is appeased and said, okay, fine, I get it. Let's go through with it after all. or he'd have to find something else. It turned out that the Sultan still wasn't happy and was really angry, actually. And so Joe quickly, in a way, you'll see with Joe, he's always kind of in a little bit of trouble, and he's always got to kind of make some quick decisions. So when you look back on it, it all looks very kind of chaotic and rash, but like not a very well planned thing. But like you can imagine at the time, he's facing kind of deadlines and real problems. So he goes to Najib Razak, who is just about to become or just becomes the prime minister of Malaysia, and convinces him, look, I've got the perfect thing for you. It will solve all your problems. You can take over this fund and we can make it a federal fund, and we'll call it One Malaysia Development, which is One Malaysia was the slogan of Najib Razak, this idea of uniting all Malaysians. The country is kind of divided between a Malay majority and Indian and Chinese populations. There's this idea of like uniting the country. He convinced them, look, I can bring in Abu Dhabi money to Malaysia. I can do all these amazing things. And also, he says, kind of on the side, this fund can also serve as kind of a slush fund for your political campaign. Because the prime minister came from this ruling party that had always been funded in different ways, usually through big businessmen would make donations, all in a very opaque way. It made the government beholden to those guys. So the politicians were always trying to come up with new ways to fund the political party without being beholden to one or two powerful businessmen.
At the moment J-Lo makes that pronouncement, hey, you can use this as a slush fund, J-Lo knows he's going down a bad path. And if the then prime minister accepts, he knows he's going down a bad path. I mean, the bad bargain's made right there, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I think the devil's bargain's made there. But on the other hand, my personal belief after all this reporting is that the prime minister never got a full picture early on of exactly what the plan was. Joe would tell him things. He gave him authority. He knew Joe was going to do things and kind of do deals that involved the siphoning away of money in some cases. He didn't really know the full mechanics of it, because if he did know the full mechanics of it, he might have said no, because they're a little bit crazy. They're not sustainable. It wasn't a sustainable scheme, and anybody could see that at the time. For example, so the first deal they did, Joe Lowe's got this $1 billion loan in a bank account, but what Joe really wants is that money for himself. Now, not just for himself in the sense that he wants to go crazy partying, which he does, but also his plan for this fund always was to use it as a front to get money to him to do his own deals on the side or in other ways, and then he would kind of put some of the money back in. The first deal he did was quickly, he was really trying to rush to get access to some of that $1 billion, because it's sitting in a Malaysian bank account. He didn't really have that much control over it. There was oversight in Malaysia. The central bank kind of oversaw what you do with foreign currency, how you send it out and stuff. So he needed to find a way to get it out of Malaysia and into his control. So the first deal he did was with this other outfit called Petro Saudi. These guys were essentially a nameplate on a door. They weren't a real serious big company. It involved a Saudi businessman and a Saudi royal who were trying to use the Saudi royal's position to kind of get fees and make introductions, get businesses into Saudi Arabia, that sort of thing. They quickly came together, Joe Lowe and these guys, and came up with this whole idea that they kind of created this sort of myth that Petro Saudi was actually an oil exploration company. And it was essentially the royal family, and it was like it was almost like a government exploration company from Saudi Arabia. And so the first deal they did, which is really one of the most brazen of all, is they struck this joint venture in an extremely short amount of time with the most minimal due diligence. And in one case, the assets of Petro Saudi were valued in a number of days, a process that should take weeks at the very least. They did this deal where Malaysia was going to contribute $1 billion, all the money they had, and Petro Saudi was going to contribute its assets, which they said was $1.5 billion of assets. Actually, it was like they had the option on a couple of oil fields, and like if that option had been carried through and they had made the full investment, then it would be worth something like that. But they had no such assets. They didn't have anything that was anywhere worth $1.5 billion.
This was the start of getting the money out of the country.
Yes. So what they did was 1MDB sent $1 billion, and before the deal, they had created this piece of paper that said, actually, the joint venture company owes the parent company $700 million. All it said was a piece of paper that said that. There was no actual loan that had been given to that joint venture company. It was just a piece of paper that said there was a loan. Malaysia didn't send all the money to the joint venture account. They didn't even really carry through with the whole plan that was originally devised to use that loan as a cover. They sent $300 million to the joint venture account, and $700 million they sent to this mysterious Seychelles company that it turns out Joe Loeb owned and controlled and set up. It's pretty amazing because the paperwork is really funny. It's like so subtle. It lists, please transfer the money. And it's like, here's our account at JP Morgan for the joint venture company. And then the other 700, please send to this account. It doesn't even say the company's name. It just has an account number. And if you follow up, you find out it's like a Coots bank account of a Seychelles company. It was totally shady.
So once he got $700 million to the Seychelles, it's game on.
It's game on, exactly. It was actually kind of a tense moment because actually compliance officers at different points were like, hold on a second, can you please verify this? Who is this company? Why are you sending it here? And all this stuff. At one point, like Joe Loeb had to fly to Switzerland and talk to a compliance officer and bring a 1MDB guy with him to kind of approve this is what they want to do.
But he's got all this political cover. He's laid this groundwork, right?
Yeah, and he hired all the guys, and he basically controls 1MDB from behind the scenes. He holds no title there, but he's the prime minister's designated kind of agent who runs the place. And even at 1MDB, former employees told us, like, we knew Joe Loeb kind of ran the place, but it didn't make sense. He had no position. The CEO just sort of got his orders from Joe. So suddenly, Joe Loeb goes from a guy that maybe is a millionaire, maybe, but also has probably a big hole chasing him, to somebody with $700 million in cash. And he just goes crazy. He just goes on. It's almost, I don't know if you've ever seen this movie from the 90s called Blank Check, where it's like a kid gets $1 million and buys all this crazy stuff and fills it in the house and stuff. That's kind of how I see it. He did a slightly more mature version of that, which is he got all his buddies together. They rented like $100,000 a month apartment in Manhattan. They traveled around all day in a fleet of Escalades, just spending money everywhere. Chartering yachts, chartering planes, spending just crazy money on stuff. Hardly any assets at this point. That was the beginning of the crazy era of Joe Loeb.
And since it was a quote, oil exploration company, there wasn't like regulators or oversight in Malaysia was not sitting around going, gee, I wonder where the money went. I mean, it was kind of like, okay, it went to something that's going to take time to develop. It wasn't like, hey, we're worried that it's gone. It's invested.
Yeah, that's right. The only people that actually have really any oversight over it is 1MDB's board. And actually, 1MDB's board was not a complete sham. And a few of those guys got really upset because at one of their first board meetings, they had authorized this joint venture because the prime minister said it was really important for Malaysia and Saudi Arabia to develop closer ties. And they're looking at the paperwork and they're like, hold on, what's this $700 million transfer? Why didn't you send all the money to the joint venture company? That's what we authorized. And actually, two of the board members basically resigned within a few months or a few weeks in some cases of that whole deal. But it remained relatively quiet. They didn't go kind of blow the whistle in a public way. They just said, I'm not going to be part of this. Like, if you guys are going to start doing crazy, weird things like this, it makes no sense. It sounds suspicious. And they got out of there. I
should point out, too, for the audience that's not aware of the movements between countries, and I don't say this in any kind of a negative way. This is historical. This is just life. But Malaysia is going to have a much closer cultural connection to the Middle East than perhaps, let's say, China or Vietnam. And Malaysia was this kind of upstart, kind of like, we're growing now. So, I mean, I think it's worth considering that close connection. Maybe Thailand might not have had the same connection with some of the Middle East players.
And that's true. Also, Malaysia is a majority Muslim country, so they have that tie as well, which is really important. A lot of Malaysians go to visit Saudi Arabia to go on Hajj or the Islamic pilgrimage. It made sense. It also sounded good for the country to have these arrangements with these wealthy Gulf countries. They also do a lot of Islamic banking, both of them. So it made a lot of sense on paper.
So what becomes the next step? So now he's got the $700 million. He's partying like a madman. He is now officially the whale. He is basically hiring all of Hollywood to be his friend. He's giving gifts to everyone. He's owning Vegas. I mean, how crazy did it get? Is there a craziest story that he did with this loot?
The craziest expenditures really came down to the parties, and there were many of these parties that he threw. He got close with these particular nightclub guys that were the key for everything. They were the key for the parties, for introducing the celebrities, for even in some cases making introductions to people who have the yachts and the planes and everything. What's also amazing is he shows if you have enough money and you go and you broadcast it out to the right people, you can really do anything you want. So within a short period of time, after having the $700 million, he was in Las Vegas with Leonardo DiCaprio for a little private party in like a giant suite of a hotel, and they were playing cards at a table. There was 20 Playboy playmates there. I mean, all the top shelf liquor and stuff. And that was just like a quiet evening for Joe Loeb. It wasn't even a big deal. But he quickly already had Leonardo DiCaprio in the inner circle because it turns out Leonardo DiCaprio really was looking for people like Joe because he wants to get these movies made that Hollywood studios are a little bit unsure about.
There you are, back to the Wolf of Wall Street right there, huh?
Exactly. And Hollywood studios had said Wolf of Wall Street was too explicit. They wanted too much money, too big of a budget. It wasn't gonna be a profitable exercise. And so Martin Scorsese and Leonardo DiCaprio were sitting around waiting for someone to come along like Joe. And once again, Joe figured out, what do people need? How do I get these guys closer to me? They need $100 million to make Wolf of Wall Street. Then I can find a way. One of the craziest parties he threw is the prologue of our book, which is he had this crazy birthday party where if you talk to a celebrity about parties like this, they're almost unparalleled because there's very rarely for a celebrity to find himself surrounded by like many, many other celebrities, unless it's the Oscar party or something like that. So this birthday party, Joe Loeb had all of the A-list celebrities, huge pop stars, and he had Britney Spears, he had different rappers, he had the guy Psy who did Gangnam Style.
It was the A-list of the A-list.
Yeah, and these guys were all like really big at the time too. Like in some cases, maybe not as much right now. Then he took over this. There's a piece of land in Las Vegas. It's like a kind of like an empty. It's quite large, but it's an empty space that they use for concerts and things. So he took it over privately. They erected. It had a kind of a carnival theme. There was a Ferris wheel inside of a building. There was a bar made of ice, like a 20-foot bar made of ice. Everybody was wearing tuxedos and red dresses. There was 3 security checkpoints just to get in. Fireworks show that like elicited noise complaints across Las Vegas. We even had the late Robin Leach was there. He's the guy that hosted Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. He was, until recently he passed away, he was a nightlife commentator for one of the Las Vegas newspapers. And even he told us, like, I've just never seen something like this. There was gifts being rolled out, like a Lamborghini, Bugattis, and there's a champagne everywhere. It's just everybody was dazzled by the scale of this thing. Probably cost $15-20 million at least, just one party.
I don't want to give away too much for the book because it's just a fascinating journalistic tale. I mean, you guys are A, so fortunate to find the opportunity, and B, to go down the rabbit hole and actually do the work. I mean, congratulations. And, people are buying this book off the shelves. It's racing off the shelves. And in fact, I do want to mention something also about Malaysia too. Another point you can add to this, but the Malaysians are quite angry right now, and they're so angry that if people check into the news, they're going to find out the prime minister has changed. This scandal is still going on. People are not very happy about this at all, and your book is doing extremely well in Malaysia, and I think there was probably some concern that it might not get to be so widespread there, but it has, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah.
You can comment on that too, but I'll tell you where I really want to shift to in our limited time left. Because, when you have a story like this and this much money starts rolling around, and just so somebody doesn't think that I'm like presenting this story from an American point of view, criticizing this smaller country in Southeast Asia, well, lo and behold, when all the money starts rolling around, guess who appears on the scene in big way? The vampire squid Goldman Sachs shows up ready to play ball, huh?
Yeah. That 700 million we talked about was just getting started, right? We're talking about 6 billion or 5 billion, and that's only 700. So he started getting very hungry for not just throwing parties and all those luxury trappings, but bigger assets. And also he had this idea of becoming this globally known businessman. It became all about him at this point. So he needed more money for that because he wanted to buy giant stakes in companies. He wanted to be himself a kind of known entity and fund. So what he did was he had made friends with this other guy who's, to be honest, pretty incredible character himself. He's called Khadem Al-Kubaisi, and he ran a different fund in Abu Dhabi called the International Petroleum Investment Company. This guy, it turns out, was just a notorious figure. This was kind of one of those sovereign funds in Abu Dhabi that was less on everyone's radar, and he had almost complete control of it on behalf of some of the royals that he worked for. This was perfect for Joe because then they came up with this craziest thing which is Malaysia started to borrow more money. They hired Goldman Sachs to borrow the money. They borrowed $6.5 billion purportedly to do these different deals, like buy some power plants and whatever. And Goldman could tell from the start that this fund in Malaysia really wanted to raise the money quickly, quietly. And they said, look, if you want to do that, you need to make sure you know it's going to cost you a lot more than it would cost if you did things like the normal way. So Goldman Sachs actually earned close to 10% of the value of those bonds issued compared to what they might normally earn, which would be maybe less than 1%.
How many Goldman Sachs executives will get in trouble on this? Like one, maybe they'll take some one token guy out and execute him, but basically Goldman Sachs will take all the money and it'll just go on being the vampire squid.
Well, we don't know. We don't know. I mean, the U.S. government's investigations into this whole affair have really kind of focused in on Goldman more than anyone, because when they first started off, they were focused on Joe, but then the Malaysian government changed and they launched their own investigations. It makes a lot more sense for Malaysia to potentially bring justice for the case, and the U.S. can focus on the U.S. entities that were somehow involved. So don't hold your breath, but at the same time, don't discount the possibility that they've got a fine in the works. So we'll see.
You've done a great job here. And as I said, people are going to really have to go. It's one of those page turners where they can really just go down the tail of like, I can't believe this happened. I mean, it's Madoff-esque. Let me ask, though, I think I saw something in the news recently that J-Lo, who is on the lam somewhere, maybe in mainland China, I don't know, but he has made some statements about your work and has basically discounted it and some non-specific rebuttals to your work. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when we were writing this book, we used our Wall Street Journal traditions, which is we never surprise anyone by what we write. We always go to them in advance. We give them a chance to give their perspective, give their own telling of a state of affairs. So we did that with Joe many, many months before our book came out on multiple occasions. His lawyers ultimately decided not to even go so far as to spell check his name. That's their decision. But it's hard to then later on say, this book is a hastily written instant history that hasn't given the justice system the appropriate chance to come to conclusion and whatever. So he basically has said it's, without being specific in any way, saying it's not a true account of what happened. And he has his own account that he's kind of keeping secret, I guess. He hasn't really given that account to anyone, no court, no public venue, to explain all these fund flows and things like that.
How does he get the protection now? I mean, is mainland China or somewhere in the Middle East, how does he get the protection when so many people like, Malaysia and now the US wants him, I'm sure too. I mean, it seems like at some point in time at the highest political channels, somebody's going to have to turn him over, I would think.
Well, it's hard to say because for a long time he was protected by Najib, who remained in power until recently, until earlier this year. In a way, Najib had a few options, I guess. This thing had become a gigantic scandal, and it's worse than the 6 billion number that we gave you, because all of the money that's missing was borrowed money, borrowed at high interest rates. So the amount of money due is considerably more. And the fund itself, debts ballooned to something like $13 billion at one point. So the prime minister just was out of ideas or what to do. How do I get out of this problem? And Joe was not going to Malaysia anymore. He was staying out of the US because he knew of all these investigations. He's spending a lot of his time in Hong Kong and Thailand and places like that. And what he did, it's kind of emerging still, was he helped China get in with Najib in a way because he could communicate accurately to China the problems that Najib faced with this debt and the missing money and that sort of thing. And so China used its One Belt, One Road program to invest in a huge way in all these Malaysian infrastructure deals. And the new government of Malaysia has said that a lot of these deals were inflated. There's money missing from those contracts that they believe was used to fill the whole of 1MDB. So Joe played this important role in helping China have more leverage over Malaysia. Now, he's been living mostly in China. He was involved in some of these deals. So if they turn him over to Malaysia, they know that he could talk about what he did for China, and it could embarrass them.
He's slick, isn't he?
Yeah, he's just good at this. This is his talent. And he also is extremely brazen. I mean, I always think that the 1MDB scandal will kind of die down soon. It can't really go anywhere new, and it always goes somewhere new. So the China is one example. But the other example is the people he's hired in the U.S. government, close to the U.S. government. So he's hired his defense attorneys in America include Chris Christie, obviously former governor of New Jersey with ties to President Trump. He hired Mark Kasowitz, which is one of Trump's personal lawyers, like a private lawyer. Bobby Birchfield, another lawyer who was Trump's ethics consultant on the transition. He's obviously, that's been in the news as well. He hired Elliot Broidy through a proxy.
You're mentioning Trump because this is the next stage of J-Lo leverage to keep himself out of trouble.
I'm not sure what it means exactly yet, other than that he is just so brazen that he's put all these guys around Trump on multi-million-dollar contracts. There's no coincidence to hire 4 or 5 people who have strong ties to Trump, other than to try to strike deals, because he's willing to deal. He's willing to give up assets to settle things, and he's really been trying to do that in every country, in Malaysia, in Singapore, in the US, maybe in Switzerland he'd be willing to do it as well. So he's trying to stay out of jail and hold on to something, I guess, and he's really motivated.
Big picture, as we wind down, I would love for you to offer some commentary because there's a bigger scenario unfolding here. And what I can't wrap my arms around is that as an American, if I want to send a $10,000 wire transfer, or if I'm in XYZ country that has capital controls, it's just damn near impossible. Of course, you mentioned the thing with the Saudi firm and the oil exploration, all that kind of stuff, but this money's been moving around. And it's amazing that basically the banking system, I'm just saying this myself, is basically above the law because they're just all getting fees all along the way and they're facilitating all this money movement. And if the money's big enough, it's going to get moved. That sure looks like the deal, yeah?
Yeah. Also, if you read our book, you can also see how Jolo's efforts to launder money or move money around changed over time. He just keeps finding a new way. When one way doesn't work anymore, there's a new way. And I think that's just the nature of the way our global financial system is set up, is that it's just a whack-a-mole game. Every time you figure out one thing, there's another way that emerges that's even better than the last way.
Like Bitcoin.
Yeah, exactly. And what Jolo understood, and maybe there will be changes on this, but it is that banking compliance officers are sort of trained to worry about certain things and not worry about other things. And it all has to do with kind of a con man's understanding of how people work. If they see a $700 million transaction and it's part of this deal and it involves this fund and there's all these people who have approved it and the central bank's approved it and everything, it's harder to believe that someone would, in a fell swoop, in seconds, take $700 million off of a fund. It's much more believable for them to say, oh, somebody drained $100,000 from this person's bank account, they're stealing it, or this person's trying to transfer money that's going to be used for some illicit purpose and it's like $50,000 or something like that. And I think he just understood that. And the way that works is when it comes to two countries doing a deal together, everyone's going to assume the numbers are going to be huge. Because here's Malaysia, the government of Malaysia, and the government of Saudi Arabia, even though it wasn't actually the government of Saudi Arabia, but it looked like it was, kind of. These guys are going to do big ticket arrangements. They got funds, they're sovereign wealth funds, and it just turns out there was just no oversight of any of these funds or any of these companies, but everyone kind of assumed there's no way that you could be using this for a crime.
It's an amazing story.
What's amazing too with Jolo is, like I said before, is he's this shy little guy, right? But on the same side, he's the most brazen, tough character that you can imagine underneath all of that, because here he is completely almost taking over banks. There's this one Swiss bank called BSI. It's a Swiss bank that's always catered to Italians traditionally. And it had this branch in Singapore that was meant to be the savior of the Swiss banking system, was opening new branches abroad because Swiss banking was getting cracked down on. And he got his foot in the door at this bank and eventually became the customer. And everything at that bank revolved around Jolo and all the people that were connected to him. All of his companies had accounts there. All of his friends did. His family did. And they were the source of all fees. And then he just kept coming up with new mechanisms, new ways. And they became more and more sophisticated to the point where now it's much harder probably for U.S. authorities to trace in the way that the earlier stuff was, because he got savvy to what they pay attention to or their tools and techniques.
You've kind of hinted at it in this conversation, describing him as shy and maybe a little chubby. I don't know his height, but I will add from my own experience that if you're in Asia and you want to judge somebody by their physical appearance, in terms of what their wealth might be. Let me tell you right now, the worst place you can possibly do that is Asia, because you just don't know who is the billionaire. You don't have any idea.
Yeah, that's true. The other lesson for me is, in general, I find that the best thing I can say about Joe Loeb is that he knows how the world actually works. And the rest of us are just a bunch of mugs who have no idea. We think that you can't do this, you can't do that, you'll get caught doing this, this would be inappropriate or whatever it might be. And all of that stuff is just, how it's actually done. So the other thing it really shows is what you can do with money. If you have money and you just are willing to spend it, you can really arrange just about anything. I mean, Joe Loeb was spending time at the White House holiday party. He arranged for Leonardo DiCaprio and these guys to go visit Obama in the White House before The Wolf of Wall Street came out in the Oval Office and present him with an advanced copy of the film. And this was all due to just developing relationships and spending a hell of a lot of money with different people. And it just keeps going on. I mean, he was the king of understanding that you can buy just about anything. There's really not much you can't buy.
Do you think that, and you'll have to correct me if I've got this wrong, but do you think that DiCaprio sort of felt that knot in his stomach when the Fed showed up and said, we'd like the $8 million Picasso back that J-Lo gave you?
Well, I doubt that they showed up at his place, demanding anything. But it's more that he probably could see the writing on the wall that he was going to be publicly embarrassed. Because technically, all of the assets the U.S. government has gone after are frozen. None of them have been technically changed ownership. Like, they all still belong to the people that have them. The government has taken custody of a few of them just because of, so in the case of Leonardo DiCaprio and Miranda Kerr, the supermodel that Joe dated for a while, they both turned over the assets. I guess they just didn't want the headache of like holding on to them pending the resolution of the case. I think probably for Leonardo DiCaprio, the story of Joe Loeb is just one of probably of just embarrassment, to be honest. Embarrassed to have been so deeply involved with a guy like this, especially because Leonardo DiCaprio, he wants to be more well known as a great actor and an environmentalist and things, not an old pal of one of the world's great fraudsters.
I've been saying for years that when you look at the investment performance of a fund, if it makes 1% every month, every year, you either have the next Madoff or the next long-term capital management. I tend to think that there's probably something coming from your work now that when you see the guy just balling like crazy in Las Vegas and he's got every A-list Hollywood person there, the red flag probably needs to go up that this goes in the rule book as a fraud. Like right out of the gate, you should know there's something wrong.
Yeah, I think there should be a rule of thumb that if someone spends more than $2 million, or maybe we'll say $1 million, in a nightclub in one night on champagne, he's probably not feeling like he really earned that money, and so you should be suspicious.
Yeah, seriously, who would actually make the money that would spend it like that? No one.
Nobody,
Absolutely.
Exactly.
I mean, nobody is going to go down that path at all.
And actually, I have a huge respect for the New York Post because they wrote one of the first articles about Joe Loeb in page 6, the celebrity section, and they wrote this amazing little article that is so prescient now to read, where they say, check out this guy. And they're the first ones that called him the whale. And they described this whole scene of him around New York with this huge entourage spending this crazy amount of money. And one of the anonymous quotes in the article is, nobody spends their own money that way. And it's true. These things should have been visible to people early on. But he had just such a charm about explaining that he was from such a wealthy family. And he created this whole backstory. He spent a lot of money on that, creating this backstory and making it look like he has a charitable foundation, that it was handed down from his grandfather and stuff. And because it was all the way over in Thailand and Malaysia, people didn't really have the ability to check that the grandfather was actually this billionaire tycoon that he said he was. And there was this phenomenon of people showing up in Los Angeles worth billions of dollars that nobody'd ever heard of before.
The book, $1 Billion Whale, The Man Who Fooled Wall Street, Hollywood, and the World. Now, I'm sure some of my audience right now are thinking, man, this sounds like a great movie. And again, how rich is that? Because it's going to become a movie.
Yeah, that's right. It's the same production group that did Crazy Rich Asians, actually, are behind the film project. Probably it'll take a couple of years to get everything going, but we're pretty excited about that.
I must ask you, and you don't have to tell me if you don't want to tell me, as an author, I've dealt with this issue before. Did you guys have the film rights? Did you get those from the publisher?
Yeah, we did have the film rights. Yeah, we did.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where can we send people beyond Amazon to check the book out, to really get into the nitty gritty, the page turner? Where else can we send people? Is there a website, anywhere you want to tell them to go?
Well, we have a website, billiondollarwhale.com, which will lead you to a few of the vendors selling the book. If you live in America, it should be in Barnes & Noble and all of the major bookstores, or Amazon or barnesandnoble.com. If you live in Europe, it may be harder to find because Joe Loeb's lawyers have threatened all of the bookstores and publishers here so that nobody has been willing to distribute it over here. In those cases, you really have to just order it from Amazon.com, the US website, not Amazon.co.uk, but Amazon.com, and have it shipped over. I know it's a bit annoying, but that's the current only option.
I didn't see a Kindle version. Was there a backstory there?
There is a Kindle version, but again, you have to go through Amazon.com or one of the American vendors. So it's kind of a country by country thing in many places in the world.
You know, this is a journalist. What's the absolute defense for a libel charge, right? You guys you got it. And now that the truth is out, it's going to be hard to put that genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. There's been no substantive disputing of any real fact of the whole book, except for, as we said before, Joe Loeb saying, oh, it's not true, in a kind of vague way. And because we're from the Wall Street Journal tradition, we'll correct an error we make, but no one's really brought us anything. And we've always felt very confident behind our reporting and the process and the documents that we've amassed and everything like that.
Cool stuff. Again, $1 billion whale, the man who fooled Wall Street, Hollywood, and the world. Appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.